friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask-us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
So we are back live here after a very interesting Sunday here at Forward Church. So we typically have two folks around the table in addition to myself who have taught at our sites, and that didn't happen quite the same way this past weekend. So
Correct.
Steve was our online teacher extraordinaire this past weekend, and then Greg, you were actually slated to teach in Kitchener, but we brought you in anyways. So new to the podcast is Greg Pattis. Greg, would you tell us a little bit of who you are, what you do here at Forward Church, and then some of the other stuff? You've got a ton of other things on your plate, and then something interesting about yourself.
Yeah, glad to do that. I'm the pastor of care here at Forward Church, and I look after congregational care, walking with people in difficult times of life and coming alongside them, and for me, that's a great privilege. And outside of Forward Church, I'm involved in an international mission agency. I'm a board chair for Canada, and also involved in prison ministry. So lots to keep myself busy and being engaged in God's kingdom work.
Mm-hmm. And give us something interesting about yourself.
Yeah, something interesting. I know Pastor Steve has been a disc jockey in his past, and probably people don't realize that, so have I.
Really? Wow. Okay.
In my young days, my brothers and I had a traveling road show and DJ and music service. So, yeah.
All right.
So here's something interesting that doesn't compare between the two of us. So we were both DJs. Greg was actually, NHL grade hockey player. Did you know that?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, superstar athlete. So he never shares that. But like me, that's not me. That's about as far from me as you can get.
But I've heard of your basketball prowess, Steve. So
yeah, right. Yeah. I have a 28-inch inseam. How good could I be?
Yeah, even with a 28-inch vertical, you're not getting that high.
No.
All right. So part of the reason we wanted to bring you in here, Greg, is that your role here is pastoral care. Yeah. And the current state of the world is in need of some good pastoral care. So we've shut everything down. We're sitting here Tuesday morning. The state of emergency has been declared for the province of Ontario. There's some anxiety in the system right now. I just love from you some thoughtful words on how do we, as people of God, take care of ourselves first and foremost in the midst of this. How do we take care of ourselves well in what will be at least a couple of weeks of quarantine, maybe longer, given the trajectory here?
Yep. Probably two things that come to my mind right away. One is self-care, which is important, and soul care. As Christians, we need to care for our souls as well, and that takes a time investment and a very intentional investment. So self-care, I don't think we're wrong to follow the guidelines that are being presented to us by our politicians and our police chiefs and people in the know in terms of what's happening with this virus. And, I think we're well in bounds to follow the lead of those who are giving us instruction in this way, looking after ourselves, but caring for our neighbors in our neighborhood and our community. So being responsible in the directives we're being given, things like social distancing and, self-isolation if necessary, but just practical wisdom is needed in times like this.
Yeah. Now, given, historically, the church has actually sort of been running into the crisis in the midst of these sorts of things, and the gospel is expanded and the kingdom shone brightly in the midst of these times. So how can we wisely, while honoring those in leadership and who have a greater sense of the impact of this virus than we ever will, how do we follow those regulations but still be the light shining in the darkness in the midst of that? How do we care for others in that?
Yeah, I think there's some fundamental understanding. I think sometimes we wrongly portray that it's a lack of faith on our part if we follow those rules. And I think sometimes we need to give ourselves permission as the church to say, no, we want to act wisely and with discernment, but we still want to be engaged vitally in serving our community. I think Christians are at their best when they're serving.
Yeah.
And as a church, this is one of the things I love about this church is that this is a church that doesn't shy away or step away or back away in times like this. We want to be vitally engaged in serving our community. But we got to do that wisely.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think there's a healthy tension there we need to keep in line and a balance in that regard. But again, part of the gospel is called to serve and sacrifice, and we're in a day like that where that's going to be required. Again, but to do it as responsibly and wisely as we can, I think it's going to be important.
Yeah, I love the highlight of just sort of the ethos of our church. I thought Keith and the leadership team did a great job this past week with we're trying to act with sound judgment and follow wisdom. And then we were in the leadership team this morning and hearing about people calling to the church saying, like, how do I get involved? Is there financial stuff I can contribute? How do I get involved in loving my neighbors well and wanting to be a part of the solution here, which I just think is wonderful. Now, Steve, your role as a teaching pastor, you got to preach to an empty auditorium here.
No, we had the band.
Yeah, the whole worship team there on Sunday morning. Have you ever been involved in anything like that before?
I've preached into a camera before with nobody in the audience, so even having a half a dozen was kind of helpful. We should have probably spread them out so I didn't always look at the same place. But yeah, these are unprecedented times, and there's going to be a new world, I think, taking shape around us. And I think we need not be afraid, but I think we need to keep in mind that we will come through this, but it'll be a different world.
Yeah.
It was a different world after 9/11. It was a different world after the Second World War.
Yeah.
It certainly was a different world after the Spanish flu in 1919. This will be a different world, and I don't think we need to fear that, but we need to just get our heads around that and walk with expectation as to what that will look like and what that means for us as followers of Jesus.
Yeah. And so we're in the midst of this series, and we didn't deviate this past week from what we were going through because I think it's actually, Greg and I were sort of chatting a little bit earlier. Like, I think that this, for such a time as this, we're talking about going upstream against the current, and with the panic and worry that's around us, I think being able to have these sorts of conversations has been really helpful. So you talked this past week about how to have hard conversations, and, I don't know that in my lifetime, the anxiety has ever been higher and just sort of the general atmosphere of the population. So very timely word.
Sure.
So if somebody was watching online, because there's 7 or 8 people here in Cambridge, somebody's watching online and they heard what you had to say, what's the one thing you want them to make sure that they walked away understanding?
Sure. I think the base message of Sunday was this, that confrontation or speaking the truth in love is necessary at times, and I'll qualify that in a second, at times, and it can be restorative and it can be helpful and constructive. It doesn't have to be explosive and further damaging or whatever. Having said that, I would like to pull the curtain back, and this is why we do Rewind, because it allows us to get into some things we don't on Sunday. Yesterday, a man in our church asked me about 1 Peter 4:8 that says, above all things, love one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. And we dialogued that a little bit. What does that have to do with confrontation and speaking the truth, and how does that work? Well, Peter actually gives that exhortation in 1 Peter to people, and it's not that you're going to atone for people's sins just by kind of loving them. What he's speaking of there, and it's actually kind of a doxology there in chapter 4, where he's kind of closing out and talking about the end is near, that the world is going to one day cease, just as it one day began, and that we would do very well not to take offense at every single thing that comes along, that love will cover those kinds of things. So I didn't have time to get into that Sunday, but not everything is confrontable. And one of the things that you can do is to not take offense. Often Satan baits us in and draws us in, and people hold offense for a long time.
Yep.
But as followers of Jesus, and I suppose we could say the supreme example of this is Christ on the cross, the ultimate God-man, the ultimate example of spiritual maturity. He's ultimately spiritually mature. There's no spiritual deficiency in him. While he's being mocked, while his clothes are being divided, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Mm-hmm. That is the ultimate response of a pure motive and a pure heart. And so not everything is confrontable. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to say that this morning because Daniel was given a very unique role in human history, mm-hmm. and to be in Babylon and be under Nebuchadnezzar. He'd been under his rule at that point probably 35 years. So this wasn't sort of reactive, kind of a responsive kind of thing that I'm going to, respond to this guy and confront him. And I just think we need to keep that in mind as Christ followers. Not everything is worth, making a big deal out of. There's many things that you just let it go and you give it over to God and let God deal with you and deal with them in those things.
Yeah, I'm thinking we probably need to hear that on repeat. Like if you just listen to that, you should probably just rewind about 3 minutes and listen to that whole thing again just to let it sink in. So if someone like me, I'm not given like this God-ordained position like Daniel was.
Sure.
What's the matrix that I make that decision through on whether or not I confront somebody about something? Do you have some sort of like helpful mechanism if you're making that decision?
Yeah. Here's the thing. I think, and again, we're talking upstream. So how do we live in a culture? We live in a microwave culture. Everything is done instantaneously. This morning, probably for our folks listening this week, the internet is running slow, and I think it's because every kid's at home gaming and watching Netflix and everything. And so, I'm in my office and I'm doing research for this coming Sunday to teach, and the internet's slow, right? And I'm like, man, it's running slow. Like, what's going on? I can't get this answer in 0.3 seconds or something. It actually takes 5 seconds to load, right? And that's the world in which we live. And I think the default thing that is a wonderful friend for us in this whole thing is time. Mm-hmm. Don't confront reactively, respond, don't react. And, things like, you get an email or something that rubs you, or you see a Facebook post and it rubs you, or somebody says something to you, just take some time to exhale and let the Spirit marinate in that. Mm-hmm. I had an unpleasant experience last week with an individual, and when I got off the phone with this person who was very unhappy with me, and they felt that I should respond, and I got off the phone and I just took time right there and I prayed and I said, Father, over the next couple of days, if this is an issue that I need to deal with in a different way, even though I may not want to, maybe my ego's gets mixed in or emotion, by your Spirit, guide me. And in a couple days, if I'm agitated in this, I'm going to have to figure this out in a different way than I thought was the way I should do that. And time can be such a wonderful friend because the Spirit does move this. And we see that in the Scripture of getting close and quiet with God and let Him speak into those spaces. And so first and foremost, and that's our culture.
Yep.
Everything got to be figured out and decided with such a sense of immediacy. Just sit and wait. Just wait, and then let the Spirit speak and guide you. I think that's fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, is there anything you would add to that as someone who you get handed a lot of these thrown into your lap in pastoral situations? Any wisdom that you'd provide from?
Yeah, just to jump on what Steve just said, I love that posture. It's really about our posture, isn't it? We have to speak truth from a place of being in awe of God. Mm-hmm. I love in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah's desire and willingness to go and speak for God comes from a place of awe of the holiness of God, but also an awareness of his own sin.
Yeah.
And, we live in a day where we just think we can just go and trumpet truth no matter what, but we have to be humble. We have to be keenly aware of the Holy Spirit's leading in any situation like that, especially one that Steve just described. But again, being in awe of God, aware of our own sinfulness, and then being able to speak truth from a place of love. And I think Daniel did that beautifully in Daniel chapter 4.
Yeah, I thought you made some really great points about waiting on God's timing and doing that out of relationship. I thought that was really essential. But I kept asking myself, as the people of God, are there times in which we need to trumpet truth or speak the truth outside of relationship? Is there a time and a place for that to happen? And if so, how would we know that that's the time? Steve, would you have anything to say to that one?
Yeah, just to clarify the question, I think you're saying when do we speak truth sort of into spaces that we have not sort of traveled in, right?
Yeah.
I think when there's egregious injustice in our world, when there's unkindness and unfairness, that we as the people of God are to speak into those situations. Now, here's the caveat to that, and I think we need to remind ourselves of this. That we do not serve ourselves well when we speak into those spaces angrily and we use an ethic and a morality that's biblical in nature to people who have no wherewithal to understand that. And so we should speak what's good and true and right, but often we demand more from people who don't walk with Jesus than we do from people who do walk with Jesus. And we've got that kind of stood on its head. And so, people who don't claim to know Christ, I think it was Dawson Trotman who founded the Navigators, and I think he's the one that said, God expects nothing of a person who's lost or has no spiritual influence in their life. And I think we need to keep that in mind. That doesn't mean we just give a free pass on everything, but we need to be careful about applying a metric against people who don't hold to the same metric. There's things that are illegal or legal, I should say. There's things that are legal that are immoral, I would say. Okay,
absolutely.
So we can hold people to that level of rightness, but as soon as you ratchet that up to the moral level, if they don't have the same metric we do as biblically oriented Christians with a Christian worldview, you're bound to have some kind of indigestion amongst people. But that doesn't mean that sort of on general justice and what's right and fair and good, we should speak into that. But we need to understand from where we stand.
Yeah, I love that. I think just sort of as you're doing that, the Old Testament prophets are just ringing through my ears. Like what God called out was often egregious injustices.
And Greg touched on it in Isaiah. If you go to and read through the prophetic books of the Bible, prophecy, the essence of a prophetic voice is speaking the truth on behalf of God. God sends the prophet forward. Of course, if you know anything about the Old Testament and about the prophets, you'll know that Jeremiah's nickname is the weeping prophet. People who have a prophetic gift, and I believe that Ephesians 4 would indicate that some people have a prophetic gifting. We had a staff member, Gary Sharp, who was on our staff, wonderful guy on staff, and at times Gary had a prophetic gifting. He would say something, and you needed to hear it, but you're like, I wish I hadn't said that, Gary, right? And here's what happens in churches, and I think we need to acknowledge this. Prophetic people in churches are often wounded people because the reality is a lot of people don't want to hear truth because it often comes at inopportune times, even though it's necessary, unwelcome times, even though it's actually reasonable. And often people with prophetic voices are wounded people. And so if you have that kind of voice, you may feel like you get dinged a bit because you do, because people sort of respond to that. But that doesn't mean you don't exercise that gift. And that's why I said on Sunday that immediate response does not compute necessarily with ultimate reality, that even with Nebuchadnezzar, right? He didn't listen. He still lost his mind for a period of time. But his ultimate reality was he worshiped God. So,
yeah. And I would say like that, again, the atmosphere is sort of like a powder keg for those sort of conversations already, right? Like we almost have somebody like with a lighter waiting at the fuse for those conversations, that it's hard to have meaningful dialogue about hard things in a reasonable fashion.
Well, and let me just add this and we can move on. But, a few weeks ago I talked about, some issues in our society that you as a Christian should really have a sense of understanding. One of them was relativism. And the ultimate danger of relativism is it removes sin, right? Because you begin to march to the beat of your own moral ethic. And so when you remove sin, then everything's relative. And let's face it, the real reason for speaking the truth in confrontation is to deal with sin.
Yeah.
Okay. And so immediately for a whole bunch of people, sadly, even some people who would identify as Christ followers, their biblical literacy and ethic is not strong enough to understand that some things are actually you're on the edge at least, and some things really are not of the Lord if you identify as a Christ one. So you're in this compromised position when you start, and that's why the volatility is there, because to even confront the sin, it's like, hey, like, live and let live, man. Like, this is me, this is you, and this doesn't work for you, but it does work for me. Well, but it doesn't work for God.
Right.
Yeah. And so in those conversations, when the powder keg is lit and the temperature starts to rise in the conversation, are there ways in which you found helpful, either through scripture or through just anecdotal evidence? How do you, Greg, maybe you can, you sort of wade in these waters pretty frequently. How do we keep ourselves level as the temperature starts to rise in those conversations?
Yeah. Well, I think speaking truth from a place of anger is the wrong place to speak it from.
Amen.
Or from a place of judgmentalism. If we're not speaking truth from a place of absolute humility, aware of our own sinfulness, aware of our own brokenness, then it's never going to come across as loving, caring, concerned. And we speak truth because we are concerned about the well-being of people, their souls, the choices they make, their life. So it has to come from that place, that posture. We have the example of Jesus who did it profoundly, and we're not Jesus. And I was thinking that in Steve's earlier point. We're not Jesus, but we're called to be his followers, and we're called to proclaim truth and in a loving, gracious, and I love that, gracious way that is winsome to people. That someone said, people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care.
Yeah.
And we have to care, and that has to be a platform or a posture from which we proclaim truth.
Yeah, and I've seen groups historically do that. They'll say, like, I'm telling you this because I love you, but everything in and around how they say what they say is filled with vitriol and hatred, or at least it would feel that way if they were talking to me. Yeah. And I just think, man, our words and our character need to be married. I think if you were to pull two themes out of this whole series, it would be the sovereignty of God, that even when it feels like the world is crumbling around us, that God has not vacated his throne and he's still in charge, and that there's a deep value in a Christ-like character that endures, right? That's what you see in Daniel and his friends along the way, is that there's a resolve to be obedient and surrendered to the will of God in ways that even are costly to them, and we'll come up against that in the next couple of weeks here.
Yeah, I think in Daniel 4, when Steve was preaching, Daniel I believe genuinely cared about Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah,
I believe he did.
He was afraid. He was disturbed at the message that he had to bring to him, and he said, I wish this was for your enemies.
Yeah,
there's a level of care there.
Yeah, and I think Nebuchadnezzar was enough of a self-involved sort of narcissistic kind of guy. Some theologians, and I think you can make a case that he was reasonably, to some degree, charitable towards the Jewish people. I think some of that was self-serving, because they probably, he knew that, to look after them, they would look after him as far as their labor and all of that. But the reality is, I think, as Greg has mentioned, is, Nebuchadnezzar invites Daniel to speak and gives him an audience. He wouldn't do that if he was a jerk.
Yeah,
because if every time Daniel came in, it's like, that guy's just an angry jerk. Everything about Nebuchadnezzar would indicate that he didn't respond well to people that didn't respond well to him, as we saw in chapter 3 with the, hey, we're not going to worship you. Okay, into the fireplace you go. And so I think, as much as he may not liked what Daniel spoke, there was something about Daniel, his countenance, his demeanor, his sense that, even though this is going to be hard, and he says, I know this is going to be hard, Daniel, but go ahead. Yeah. Lay it on me, right? And that's, speaking the truth in love.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I wanted to mention was Paul in 1 Thessalonians. He writes to the church at Thessalonians, he says, we speak not to please man, but to please God. And here's what he says at the end, who tests our hearts. Oof. Right? So we're speaking, but God is testing our hearts. That's that whole issue of motive that we talked about on Sunday, right? And we must always keep that in mind. We're not doing this to please this person, but can I, as difficult as this is, can I experience the pleasure of God who's testing my heart by the way that I did this?
Yeah. I love that. And just thinking through, like, Daniel could have been a much shorter book if Daniel was a jerk, right? Like, it would have ended real fast.
Yeah.
Sort of nearing the end of our time here, I'd love maybe some real life examples from you guys. So we'll start with Steve. Steve, is there an example of a time when someone confronted you well, that they came to you with some sort of thing, and you don't have to, air your dirty laundry here, but just sort of what were some of the things that made it helpful for you to receive? And then Greg, and some of your pastoral experience, when you've confronted someone, when have you seen a healthy Christ-like response to that correction? So Steve, we'll start with you. When have you been corrected well?
Many times. I've been an employer or a boss since I was 17 years old. So I'm 56. So, I've had a lot of people work for me, and sometimes as many as 100 people. So you'd think I'd be a better boss than I am. But anyways, nonetheless, here we are. And I've had times where people have come to me, and I've tried to maintain an open door policy. And I know sometimes I can be a bit intimidating in that role. But people have come to me and said, you got a minute, shut the office door. And they said, you said this, or you did this, or and I've tried to maintain an attitude towards people like, if there's something wrong, then you come and, it doesn't matter if I'm the boss, right? You come and sort it out. And I've had many people over the years, because I'm a very imperfect boss, feet of clay, and they've come and shut the door and shared that. And I've had it where we've both ended up crying and hugging at the end, right? And I've just felt like, wow, something has been lifted. Now, I will say, if there's something that saddens me, I don't think it angers me, but it saddens me in those situations, is I've had people come to me that something happened years before, and I'm like, man, I wish you hadn't carried that, because obviously they've carried it.
Yeah.
And so part of speaking the truth or confronting well is, yes, you do that, you allow time to marinate, but not years. Like once you sense that there really is a trespass and there's a hurt and there's a bitterness or whatever, and that person really did do something that was sinful, or said something that was sinful or whatever, then I believe as Christ followers, we do have a responsibility. Not to take offense at every little thing, but there's sometimes where things we go, I just have to deal with this, and dealt in the right way. And again, people have done it. They haven't tried to embarrass me or hurt me. Can I talk really quick story? Quick anecdote? Yeah. Okay. So Max Aitken, who was at one time was the publisher of the most subscribed newspaper in the world. Okay. Like back, and this would be probably in the late 50s, and had like 2.5 million subscribers. Okay. And Edward Heath, was a member of Parliament in Britain. And Aitken had moved to Britain as a newspaper, very successful guy, like hard charger, successful guy. And Ted Heath became the Prime Minister of Britain, ultimately. But Max Aitken, he wrote a scathing article of him in the newspaper, okay, and just hammered him, right? Like it was really unkind. So in a restaurant in London, Max Aitken goes into the bathroom and Ted Heath is in the men's room, okay? And so, the awkwardness, and this is a few weeks afterwards, right? And Aitken feels sort of convicted and feels like he's offended him and he's treated him improperly. And before Ted Heath can say anything or do anything, he feels he should make the first move. And he says, I'd like you to know that what I wrote in the newspaper, I realize was unkind and offside, and I'd like to apologize. And great line, Ted Heath responds and says, well, that's fine. I accept that. But I really, in the future, I'd much rather that you offend me in the washroom and apologize in the newspaper. and sometimes, sometimes how we do this is vastly important, right? As you say, how do people do it well? We don't want to do it, publicly or embarrass people or anything like that. And that does, that's part of how to do this well.
Yeah. So stewarding the heart of the person who you're confronting, right? Like that's sort of what I'm hearing.
And stewarding, because what's the goal of this? The goal of this is reconciliation and restoration. That's the goal of it. That's the end game. This is simply process. You got to get the process right to get to the end game. That's why we talked about process quite a bit on Sunday. But the end game is that this can be redemptive and restorative. That's the goal.
All right. Now I'm throwing to you, Greg. Any pastoral experience of confronting someone with some hard truth and them responding well, and what were sort of the ingredients to let that happen?
Yeah, let me just say right at the outset, for every 10 times I've done it right, I've probably done it wrong 100 times.
Yeah.
And God teaches us in this journey, and so thankful that he's gracious to us. But when people come to see me and call me, and I know they're carrying a burden, maybe some issue in their life, and I can tell when they walk in my office, their shoulders are stooped, their heads down, and I know they're going to tell me something that's difficult for them to say. Before they say anything, I'll pray with them and I'll tell them two things. I'll say, first of all, what you're going to share with me is confidential, so that it gives them a sense that they can safe. It's a
Unless
safe
you're
space.
sharing it on a podcast.
Well,
I think you can count on it. You're pretty safe with Greg.
Yeah.
the second thing I'll tell them is, no matter what you're about to tell me, I promise you that I won't look at you any differently after than I am right now. And again, that just helps them understand that I want to deal with them with grace. Okay. And so it really gives me the opportunity then to speak truth. And so there's been a number of occasions, and again, to God be the glory, because ultimately it's His work, it's His word, and we're just His vessels. But what speaking truth into people's lives has brought tears from me to them, them in hearing it. And I'll always try to preface it with the fact that this is not me speaking, this is God speaking. And God is speaking into your life because He loves you.
Yeah.
And He doesn't want you to continue in this path of sin or this choice, this lifestyle choice or whatever it is, because He loves you. And He doesn't want you to experience the pain and the brokenness and the hurt. And again, I find people are far more receptive to that. And I've said to people as well, I said to someone the other day, I said, if you want to really walk through this, I promise you, I'll call you out. And he said, thank you. I need to be called out. But again, it's always going to be done with grace and hopefully with love and with a desire to see God work, not me. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that really rings true of where you started on Sunday, Steve. Like, it's got to be the motives, like to understand that you are speaking on behalf of God. Like, that's a weighty calling, right? You don't walk into that lightly with, the tainted motives that you were sort of trying to uncover for us.
God's not going to participate in that. And so then you're done before you got started.
Is there ever, so I'll throw this last question out there and then we'll sort of wrap things up. Is there ever a time where what you're confronting is important enough that your motives are not pure, but you need to move forward? And if so, how would you do that? So like you had the example of a couple of husbands and there was a past hurt sort of lingering, and then he was trying to confront how husband A was interacting with his wife, but husband B still had some, hurts in his trunk that he wasn't willing to let go of. Is there a time in which that confrontation is necessary, and how do you move forward if you're still holding on to some stuff?
Yeah, I think two things I would say to that is, number one, you need to get before God and figure that out. And that's why the Galatians 5, passage is incredibly healthy. Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy, he says, the basis of our charge is love, right? And a clear conscience. And that's how we move ahead, Timothy. Now, having said that, what if there's a time where and here's the thing, nobody comes to a lot of things neutral, right? We all have our own hermeneutic, our own way, because we've all been dinged and shaped and in the world, right? So how do you do that? I think the potential safeguard is to acknowledge that impure motive before God and ask for cleansing, and then further to acknowledge the person you're confronting that there's some stuff. So in the illustration I gave Sunday, you confront that other husband and say, "Now, Fred, I'm going to tell you right up front, a few years ago you said something that really hurt me. And I've went before God with that, and I hope that that's not fueling what I'm about to say to you, but I want to acknowledge that before you, that I'm carrying that too. And so I hope that with the help of God's Spirit, and I've confessed that to God, and I've asked God to free me from that and cleanse me from that. But that has been in here, and the flesh has been at war with that, and I haven't been delivered of that. So I think you acknowledge that before the person. It's the elephant in the discussion, right? Where the guy's saying, well, I remember that I was a jerk with you, and that's probably why. So you acknowledge that, and it'll let some of the air out of the balloon, I think. But first, before you've done that, you've acknowledged that before God and ask God to heal you and cleanse you of that, which, frankly, as Christians, we should do that much sooner than later, because the love does cover a multitude of sins.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a perfect end cap to this conversation. We're going to move forward this Sunday. We're actually going to take a little detour from our conversation. And Steve, you are going to bring a message again. We're doing this whole thing online. So keep subscribing to podcasts and all that sort of fun stuff. So do you want to just sort of give us a teaser of where you're headed on Sunday?
Sure, I can. The leadership of the church has asked me to kind of go off script or go off the series because we're in these unprecedented days. And I was given that charge on Sunday afternoon. And so since then till today, the last couple of days, I've really prayed about that and said, God, this is a high and holy task, and people are listening. And here's where I want us to land, I think, on Sunday is we're not experts on the biology and the physiology of of COVID-19. And so we need to drive within our lane. Here's what we are of the people of God. We're to speak into the spiritual aspect of this. And so I'm hearing people that I'm thinking, you're not really an expert. So here's where I want to go on Sunday. And I think God has given me the nod to do this. I think the ultimate question that a lot of people are having, both people who would identify as Christ followers and people who would say no, is the question is this: where's God? Where's God? Like our world seems to be maybe not unraveling, but at least some of the seams are being pulled pretty, and so I want to address that. And I want to address it from a Bible story that has all of these elements, disappointment, fear, the unknowingness, relationships, and all of that. And a story in the Bible that I think will be familiar to a lot of people that powerfully shows not only where God is, but who God is. It shows the heart of God. And so I think, and for those of you who are listening to the podcast and you're one of God's people and part of Forward Church, would you pray for me? I need God's help in this. I really need God's help in this message. And I think God will speak to us from his word on Sunday. And I pray to that end. So listen in.
Amen. We expect that as well. So in these times of social distancing and all that sort of fun stuff, we really do want to stay connected. So if there's stuff out of these podcasts or in the midst of the uncertainty of this world.
So we're not kissing at the end like we do?
We will not dismiss each other with the holy kisses.
No holy kisses. Okay, fair enough.
You can't even do pound it anymore. You can't do that. A holy hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
That's what we'll do.
Yeah. Touch knees or something, I think is what you do.
That's about as close as you can get. So in the midst of that, we do want to stay connected. So if there's something from these podcasts or from Steve's sermon on Sunday, we want to hear from you. So head to forwardchurch.ca/ask us and stay connected with us in that way. And then we, again, want to be responding to what's going on in your hearts and your conversation. So thankful for Steve and for Greg joining us. And until next week, we will see you again.
Thanks.